Hello. Well, it's time to wrap up the 2024 hurricane season, and a memorable one indeed. As expected, it was a busy one. This was the original forecast versus average, the forecast from Colorado State University, Dr. Phil Klotzbach, the NOAA forecast, and then the actual numbers for 2024. And unfortunately, the forecast for an above-average season was correct, with 18 named storms, 11 of those becoming hurricanes, and 5 of those 11 becoming major hurricanes. And we went through that name list pretty quickly overall. We only had 3 left: Tony, Valerie, and William. We used all the other names in the 2024 list. And remember, if we were to exhaust that list, we would simply go on to the standby names that are out each year once we go beyond the actual alphabetical list that is already established. So let's check out this season as a whole, because we started out with a pretty busy June overall. And what was interesting was we didn't have a real busy peak of the season. And here's what I mean. Check out the seasonal average. This is how the typical season goes. And then we look at 2024, and we started out with a powerful hurricane. More on that in a minute. And then a lull here where we'd expect things to start to pick up later in August into September, only to see a very busy late September into October and very early November. So it was skewed a little bit from what is typical. So we take a look at the named storms here. The most named storms in a single season, well, that was 30, and it wasn't that long ago. It was in 2020. The 30-year average, as we saw, was 14, and we were certainly above that number. For hurricanes, we take a look at the number of hurricanes per year, and you can see all the numbers going all the way back to 1851, with the record at 15, the average at 7 hurricanes, and of course this year, well more than that at 11. And then we look at major hurricanes, which is a category 3 or higher, and we saw the number of these storms too, much higher than average. The average 3, we were at 5 such storms, 3 or 4 or a 5 category, and the record's 8, so we didn't get to the record, but still obviously a very busy hurricane season overall. And here's the Atlantic Basin. There were a few storms that stayed well out to sea, but there were a number that went through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico yet again, kind of a hot spot, if you will. We saw 5 landfalls on the U.S. coastline this year, and they were all hurricanes. Beryl, a Cat 1 at landfall in the U.S., Francine, a Cat 2, Debby, Helene, and Milton all made landfall in Florida, as you can see here. Beryl, a Cat 1 on the southeast coast of Texas. Francine, a Cat 2 on the south central coast of Louisiana. Helene, terrifying storm for the Big Bend on up to the north, where it continued to cause considerable damage, making landfall as a Category 4. Debby was a Category 1 in early August, and Milton a Category 3 as well, with a landfall not too far from Tampa. So Garrett, Trevor, and Corey are all going to look at these storms. Milton, well, Trevor will be looking at what occurred with Milton and the impacts. Corey will take a look at Debby, and Garrett first with a look at powerful Helene.
Hurricane Helene, really made its mark across a lot of the U.S. here. Here's late September, the 26th, the 27th here, making landfall as a major hurricane here for the Big Bend east of Tallahassee. It spared Tallahassee a lot. At one point, it could have been a little bit farther to the west with the forecast, but well to the west of Jacksonville. But our area here, Columbia County up into, Ware County, some power outages there and a lot of rainfall and wind, but it moved at a pretty good clip, but it did give a lot of rain and wind up into Georgia, power outages, a lot of tree damage up into the Augusta, Georgia area and the mountains of western North Carolina. We'll show you here in just a second all of that damage that we did see there and the flooding rainfall here in the mountains. But for us locally, here's a radar screen grab here from the Thursday at the landfall. Look at that, just to our west. There is that major hurricane landfall here in September. So this was what was one of 5 major hurricanes in the Atlantic hurricane season. It gave us wind gusts in some spots 70 to almost, at one point, 80 miles per hour here at a JFRD station there on the WeatherStim network there. NAS Jax had a 74 mile per hour gust. So we did see, despite being well away from the center with this large wind field with Helene, we saw 60 to 78, even 80 mile per hour winds with this. That's why we tell you to pay attention even away from the center. In terms of rainfall, there's all that rain across the deep south. This is a 3-day rainfall estimate, 1 to 4 inches, especially west of Jacksonville here, and then up into the Carolinas. That's where all that flooding rain they had leading up to this event too. They had a lot of rainfall, and that exacerbated the hurricane impacts and had some tree damage as well. So it was the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the Big Bend of Florida on record, the lowest air pressure for a Florida hurricane since Michael, and then the 4th U.S. Gulf Coast hurricane landfall of the year out of 5 total. We had Milton as well. So I wanted to show you some of the damage that we did see with Helene here in Florida. We have some video there. You can see just across the state, we had heavy rain, we had gusty winds. Led to power outages. Columbia County had a lot of power outages here in our local viewing area. So just a night of heavy rain and wind that left behind some of this damage across the state here from this hurricane. Now, we also look into the Carolinas where we had some of the damage as well with all that flooding rainfall. There's the flooding. This is from, the North Carolina, Tennessee area. A lot of that flooding rain that just wiped away certain sections of the state. So Helene will be remembered. Definitely a historic hurricane of the 2024 hurricane season.
Less than a month after Hurricane Helene, we had Hurricane Milton form in the Gulf of Mexico, a Category 5 hurricane at its peak with a very low pressure of 897 millibars at its lowest. And this also brought impacts to Florida as it eventually landfalled as a Category 3 hurricane. Forming October 5th in the Bay of Campeche, an area of low pressure began to develop and became a tropical storm. And as it meandered in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico, it became the year's 9th hurricane on October 6th, rapidly intensifying into a Category 5 hurricane the next day, October 7th, as the pressure fell to 897 millibars, which was the lowest observed pressure of a storm in the Atlantic since Hurricane Wilma in 2005. It stayed at that intensity for quite a while, weakened a little bit, and then re-intensified into a Category 5 storm once again on October 9th, aiming right towards Florida, fortunately weakening in terms of its wind speed, but still bringing major impacts to the state. Landfall Siesta Key on October 9th as a Category 3 hurricane, and as bad as it was, it did spare the Tampa Bay area from the worst of the storm surge, and that was the nightmare scenario that was worrisome to much of central Florida. The worst storm surge was south of the landfall location, but still bringing significant impacts not only to south and central Florida, but we also saw impacts locally across northeast Florida and southeastern Georgia. Primarily areas south of Jacksonville saw upwards of 11 inches of rain, which caused major flooding for Flagler Estates, Hastings, Spuds, and Willaca. 40 to 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts were observed, which did cause some power outages, but not as much as Helene across our local area. And we did see some inundation along the coast and the river, but it wasn't too bad, fortunately. More significant impacts were to our south with a prolific tornado outbreak with the outer rain bands. These were all the tornado warnings that were issued on Milton's approach, and several of these produced significant damage, and that wind damage was also big as well. The iconic Tropicana Field in Tampa saw major roof damage, and here's a picture there of from Milton with those winds that gusted over 90 to 100 miles per hour. Fortunately, this was the last storm to impact Florida for the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season.
A busy 2024 hurricane season indeed, with 3 named storms making landfall along the coast of Florida. The first one was Debby. That's how we got things kicked off, at least for the Sunshine State. Beryl was the first one that made landfall for the U.S. That made landfall along the Gulf Coast of Texas. Debby is kind of hidden in here amongst all the tracks. It was a busy year for the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So let's zoom in. At the end of July, we were starting to see hints of development near the Caribbean, and we got those first alerts from the National Hurricane Center as well. And then on August 3rd, the first tropical depression formed. That's when we got the first cones or tracks of what eventually became Tropical Storm Debby in the southeast Gulf of Mexico. It was basically due west of Tampa August 4th, and then the evening and night of August 4th, it lifted up to the Big Bend, made landfall near Steinhatchee. It threw some wind, heavy rain, even a few tornadoes to our local area, and yes, it made landfall as a Category 1 hurricane. Then it moved inland. It weakened back to a tropical storm, but it moved right over our southeast Georgia counties, the center of Debby, over Charlton, Ware, and Brantley counties. Then it tracked up towards Savannah, made a little loop out over the Atlantic, and then made another landfall just north and east of Charleston. Debby brought a ton of rain, though, up towards Savannah and Charleston, even though we did see pretty significant rain in northeast Florida and southeast Georgia. Here's the first track of, at the time, what was Tropical Depression 4 that eventually became Debby in the Gulf. The National Hurricane Center did a pretty good job, not just with the track, but also with the strength of Debby. Debby, I say only, became a Category 1 hurricane. There's no such thing as just a tropical storm or Category 1 hurricane, but the National Hurricane Center almost pegged the strength right on, and it almost nailed the precise track of where Debby moved into the Big Bend. Here's what Debby brought us. The highest wind gusts in northeast Florida and southeast Georgia, the highest one was 62 at Fort George Island. Even the Jacksonville Beach Pier had one of the highest gusts, up to 61. A lot of spots had all of those gusts 30 to 40 miles per hour. We had widespread tropical storm force wind gusts. There were no sustained winds greater than 40 miles per hour. The bridges never closed. We certainly like to see that. This was the rainfall forecast a couple of days before. It looked pretty impressive, the rain that Debby was going to bring us. The forecasts were 10 to 15 inches of rain, in some cases a little more, up into southeast Georgia and farther inland in northeast Florida. But the rain amounts were a lot less farther to the south in northeast Florida. And here's what we got. There were some neighborhoods on our neighborhood weather station network powered by Tempest that got a foot of rain as Debby moved over. But those rain amounts were less, almost a third of that, closer to 3 to 4 to 5 inch rain totals for Putnam and St. Johns counties. We had spots in St. Johns County that got almost 4.5 inches of rain. We also saw a few tornadoes from Debby in Union and Columbia County. Chief Meteorologist Mike Burrish and myself were bringing live updates on CBS 47 and Fox 30 when these tornadoes were occurring to the west of Worthington Springs in Union County, and then in Columbia County to the south of Lake City, near the Lake City Air Park, near Highway 41 and I-75. We stayed tornado-free in the Jacksonville metro and most of the area. Here's some interesting comparisons. So Debby is not the first Debby. We had Debby in 2012 that impacted northeast Florida, and we also had Idalia from last year. That was really the only Florida impact from the tropics. So all these tracks, there are some differences, but also some similarities. The silver line is Debby 2024, the green line is Debby 2012, and then the pink line is Idalia. So the similarities, these were all Gulf of Mexico storms. The differences, though, they all formed kind of in different spots. The track and the strength were all different as well. Idalia was much stronger than both of the Debbys. Idalia was a hurricane. It was a major hurricane before landfall. It was coming off of its peak, though, and it was weakening as it made landfall. Debby in 2012 was a tropical storm, and Debby this year made it to hurricane strength, basically right at landfall. And the rain from Debby in 2012 was very, very significant. We had 1 to 2 feet of rain that fell in portions of northeast Florida. In fact, Curtis Mill in Florida out toward the Big Bend, right there, 28.78 inches of rain, with even some spots in northeast Florida receiving between 1 to 2 feet of rain.
So a pretty good review there of some pretty significant storms. Thanks, Corey, Trevor, and Garrett. And kind of interesting here, too, as we look at the landfalling major hurricanes in Florida over the last 10 years. We now add Helene in 2024, as well as Milton, the Category 4 and 3, respectively. That goes along with devastating Cat 5 Michael back in 2018, which hit Mexico Beach and the central Florida panhandle. Idalia coming ashore as a low-end Cat 3 back in 2023. Irma, memorable storm. Cat 4 coming up through the Keys, then western Florida, and causing one of the greatest floods in history in downtown Jacksonville. Ian, a Cat 4 in 2022 that came ashore at about Fort Myers Beach. So it's been a busy last 10 years for Florida and major hurricanes, which are Cat 3 or higher. Something to take away from this 2024 hurricane season would be the average return period of hurricanes within about 50 miles or so of any one of these spots. And as you can see in northeastern Florida and southeast Georgia, particular for Jacksonville and northeastern Florida. It's why one of the reasons we love it here so much. We don't see a return period that's very frequent. About every 12 to 13 years, we get a hurricane within 50 miles of one of these points, and that would include Jacksonville. But a word of caution, it's the same statistic for the Big Bend. And look what's happened over the last few years. Idalia, Debby, and Helene have all come ashore in the Big Bend. Highly unusual, statistically not likely, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. Something for us to keep in mind right here at home in Jacksonville and northeastern Florida and southeast Georgia. Of course, we always track the tropics. The season runs from June 1st to November 30th, but we're always tracking the weather too. Of course, the weather never sleeps. Storms never sleep either. So Corey and Trevor and I and Garrett will continue to talk and track the tropics. I have it updated every single day during the hurricane season, Talking the Tropics with Mike, as well as the Burrish blog at actionnewsjax.com and our radio partners, 104.5 WOKV. Until 2025 and the beginning of the next hurricane season, I'm Action News Jax Chief Meteorologist Mike Burrish.